Chinatown has changed throughout the years. It's not the same anymore. It really hasn't transformed for me for the better. The city doesn't care about it. The mayor doesn't care about it. The governor doesn't care about it. And I think it's because we're Chinese. And no matter how we protest and how many marches we have in Chinatown, they don't care.
There hasn't been any affordable housing built since 1976. In that time, we've got an expansion of the jails. In that time, we've got an expansion of homeless shelters. These are failures of government that drive Chinese people away from New York City's Chinatown and into the boroughs and out of state.
Chinatowns were born out of explicit segregation and discrimination on the part of the government and the wider population. The immigrants and the laborers that were here during that time period were sort of forced into certain areas that were considered undesirable at the time, like near cramped city centers, without full public services at that time. But there's also a really incredible history of community building. These were also communities that were safe places for people to be and for new immigrants to seek community, their homes, and places of work in. We've added in a third element at this point, I think, which is sort of the tourism and fetishism of Chinatowns by visitors and by local governments that we also have to deal with, that complicates the legacy, I think, even a little bit more. But remembering that these are places that were born of struggle, but also of safety and solidarity, I think is really important when we're thinking about why do we need to preserve these communities. It's because they still serve these core functions that they did back during their founding. Thousands of people are depending on the services that they can find in language, in community. Maintaining the boundaries of Chinatowns and other similar ethnic enclaves is critical for the survival of immigrant and low-wage working class families who need these communities to continue to be safe and affordable.
My grandfather came to Chinatown in approximately 1890. I'm a third generation Chinatown resident and business owner, and I manage my family's properties here in Mott Street. One of my responsibilities as a community organizer is to point out when the city is creating unwanted land use barriers that hem in our growth. It's important for community people like myself to speak out when things like a mega jail is proposed, or when the ever-increasing occupation of Park Row by the NYPD is ever increasing and fortifying. As a community that's trying to grow over the last 150 years, we have to speak out against it when government is making huge mistakes, sacrificing our community and our lives and our quality of life and our health.
A lot of Asian American organizing protest movements have, I think, been under-recognized in the media and broader social conversation. But there's actually really long and really rich histories of resistance in these communities. A historic example is the 1982 garment workers strike that happened here in Manhattan's Chinatown. At that time period, not many folks know that Chinatown was home to hundreds of garment factories employing tens of thousands of workers, many of them being paid very low wages, and most of them being Chinese women. In 1982, work conditions had kind of reached a fever pitch, and the union that represented a lot of the garment laborers was pushing for a much stronger contract.
Enough is enough. They have faked their desire to negotiate, and in the end, they rejected the contract for the second time.
工人應該要團結，我哋啲工人係靠一個人嘅力量唔得，我哋要全體工人45000幾個工人出來。
It was a really powerful moment where I think a population that isn't usually very visible came out in full force on the streets of New York City. And the union ended up winning a much stronger contract as a result.
There's been a jail in Chinatown since before there were even Chinese people in Chinatown. In the 80s, they're trying to build what is currently in Chinatown. The Chinese population came out in like huge numbers. Like, I think kind of like tens of thousands of people were on the streets protesting the jail construction. Factory and restaurant owners would send their workers out to protest as part of, like, they got the day off from work so they could. People have been doing activism and protesting around jail construction there for a long time. The reason that the jail is being built is because Rikers Island is being closed. I think 30-something people have died in Rikers in the last 3 years. And so unless the city changes the Department of Corrections leadership, what would change? I mean, the issue is not the space, literally, of Rikers Island, and that's part of the problem. The issue is that you're detaining people in a place housed, like, staffed by corrupt corrections guards. What the jail in Chinatown represents for a lot of people is that the kinds of violence you're seeing on Rikers is going to come to Chinatown, because unless something changes with the Department of Corrections, you're going to have the same problems.
This is the two jails that exist as they are today, isolated from the rest of the buildings around it. This animation shows the size of the proposed jail in red, and also the mechanical tower, which is an additional 50 feet.
And we would like to know from you what your plan B is, and we would like to get a commitment from you that we will have a seat at the design table to make sure that this is right size, right scale, and right for our community with the least amount of impact.
And you have not done the proper studies, and you are not prepared to move forward. And therefore, we have to say, stop this process right now. Do not certify this today, because you have not done your due diligence. You have not told us how you're going to take care of us, and we don't trust you. Mainly, we do not trust the mayor with the lives of thousands and thousands of people.
As it is today, the city is moving forward. There is no change of plan. The mega jail is happening. There is no change in terms of the size and scale and scope of what they want to build here.
How can we trust anything that this same administration is telling us about what they're going to do with this project? Doesn't that give us an indication of what's going to happen to our children? Will we be a memory? Will we not be included?
It was discriminatory.
Yes.
It was predatory.
Yes.
And it is a form of violence, and I reject that.
That's right.
When Mayor Adams campaigned here, standing side by side with so many of you, he called this jail institutionalized hate. Institutionalized hate against the Chinatown community that has already suffered so much. Mr. Mayor, now that you are our mayor, now that you are the institution, do you still stand with the community of Chinatown? Do you still stand with us?
Folks are most concerned about environmental health, the impacts that a really long construction process is going to put onto the community. I've heard concerns about increased traffic and congestion. I've heard concerns about community safety and what a larger carceral presence is going to bring to the neighborhood. But there's also a more long-term risk of changing the neighborhood and accelerating some of those displacement pressures that are already there. So Chinatown is already feeling very vulnerable to luxury development, which is, raising tenement buildings or converting old warehouses into luxury condos, to hotels that are geared towards higher income outsiders, things like that. And I think there's the risk that the jail and its impact on its surrounding neighbors is going to have on continuing to push out the low-income residents that are there.
The way that the jail construction contributes to gentrification in Chinatown, I think, is more through making the neighborhood harder to inhabit. So it'll be a long construction process. There's a lot of dust already. There's a lot of noise. Chinatown is built actually on this very unstable landfill. And so it sinks sometimes. The construction of this enormous building is going to affect, in some ways, probably the other buildings around it. The senior center that's at the jail location has had, I think, a wall fell down. I mean, it's obviously a pretty major issue, and they've had other kinds of like cracks from just the disturbances from the construction.
Neighbors United Below Canal was founded by Chris Marte and myself and Howard Huey, who in 2018 really saw a need to create an entity that would represent business, residents, and people who have an interest in Chinatown in response to the city's plan to create the tallest jail in the world. This entity would act as a clearinghouse of information, but also act as a conduit between our government and our residents and businesses, so that the complicated land use process could be understood and then also talked about in a way that everyone would understand. We also knew that there was a possibility that a lawsuit would be one of the ways that we could make our voices heard to protest against what we found was an illegal land use process. We needed an entity that would be able to lobby for legal representation, political representation, and community representation. We are a consortium of architects, engineers, legal professionals, residents, business people, who cumulatively have an innate sense of our neighborhood that is much higher level than what the local government has. What we've tried to do as NUBC is we've tried to educate people the differences between a punitive institution, which is a prison, versus a jail, which is a detention center. 2/3 of the population of all jails are holding detainees awaiting trial. 1/3 of those may be serving short sentences, 1 to 2 years.
There's been protests since the plan was announced when it was approved in 2019. They started doing a lot of protests. And then there was sort of like tons and tons and tons and tons of protests like during the pandemic. I think people were relating it to Stop Asian Hate. Actually, like Eric Adams, who is currently mayor, right? He came to Chinatown and said we shouldn't build this jail in Chinatown.
No new jail, no building up a jail in this location. We can do a better job, and I know it's possible to solve the problems we are facing in incarceration without the destructions of community. So I'm here with you, side by side.
And then, of course, he became mayor and then is building the jail in Chinatown. There's certain groups. Youth Against Displacement is really active in protesting the Museum of Chinese in America for taking money that was associated with building the jail.
We've also talked to members of the Lippman Commission, and it's important to understand who the Lippman Commission is. They were the de facto architects, and I put that in quotes, of the borough-based jail system. They were the ones who came up with the idea of how to close Rikers Island, and that was to put these jails into the communities, which is Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens.
And let's make sure that the neighborhood also views this as an asset for them, because it should be and will be. And here's some terrific work done by the Van Allen Institute for the Lippman Commission, sort of thinking through what one of these justice hubs might be, much to Marty's point of sort of a community justice center. And critically, none of this can happen without New Yorkers' engagement on every level, including sort of the design, siting, and other things.
However, the Lippman Commission was a racist organization. Although we have 25% of the jails projected for the next several years, we have zero representation on the Lippman Commission in their first iteration. To this day, it remains 98% non-Asian. and no changes have taken place. We still bear 25% of the borough-based jails and 25% of the cost and of those things, and yet we remain with an organization that's 98% non-Asian. Chinatown site is among the most densest areas of Lower Manhattan. It's also a site that has a very high water table because there used to be a pond underneath this site, and it's still fed by water to this day. That means that it's a dangerous site to build upon. And we're calling on the city to reconsider, and we're calling on the Lippman Commission to reconsider the size and scale and scope of what they want to put here based on the information that we've been able to gather over the last 5 years by qualified professionals. When the city is building something that's completely out of scale and has proven to be dangerous, certainly we should have something to say about that. And that's why it's so offensive that when they created the Lippman Commission, no one thought to include Asian people, Chinese people specifically, who is the community that has lived among jails the longest in the whole city. So I blame that on a racist attitude toward Chinese Americans to exclude us from the conversation, even though no community in New York City has lived with jails in their community for as long as we have. That's institutionalized racism. We knew that when we were protesting, there was a risk to be arrested. We were blocking government-hired contractors from doing their job. That is illegal. And we knew that by doing so, as a form of peaceful protest, there was a risk of being arrested.
No jail! No new 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 jail!
$10 billion for the construction of these new jails when there are budget cuts across the city to our programs, to our services, to education, for our kids. $10 billion.
Fortunately, a Chinese man who was working for one of the contractors did fall to his death sheerly because of negligence. This was not something that was his fault. This was completely a negligent violation by that contractor. We have found similar, although they didn't result in a death, there have been injuries at the Manhattan site to workers working at that site, as well as physical damage. And so not only that, in Brooklyn, they had an entire 100 feet of fencing that just fell down over the whole weekend, and anybody could have walked onto their construction site. So the point being is that these processes of taking down these existing jails to build new jails is not without negligence, death, injuries, obfuscation. The contractors often try to hide what's happening so that they don't report it to the government, which is illegal. So by no means is this a smooth and seamless and safe process. We're calling for an independent monitor so that these sites, at least our site in Chinatown in particular, is overseen by some hired professional to make sure that both the workers at the site and particularly our residents are safe.
Manhattan's Chinatown has a lot of different organizations, community organizations that are playing an important role in efforts to preserve Chinatown as a multifunctional neighborhood, meaning a place where people can live as well as work and as well as for all sorts of social and cultural and economic and other reasons. As opposed to, let's say, becoming what people deride as an ethnic Disneyland, a place that might look like Chinatown in some of its architectural features and a little bit of commerce. And Washington, D.C. is the classic example, unfortunately, in the United States of a place where very few Asian Americans still live.
The census, you saw that Chinatown had about 2 in 3 Asian residents.
That was before this arena opened in 1997. A lot has changed since then. Back then it was called the MCI Center, now the Capital One Arena. Back then, this was Chinatown, the Friendship Archway welcoming visitors. Now, the archway is still there. The names of neighborhood businesses are still written in Chinese as required in DC's Chinatown. Most of the businesses themselves are not Chinese.
I think it's just going to get worse. It's people that don't live here that are making all the decisions for it. And once they budget for it, it's really hard for them to take that money and say, okay, we're not going to use it for this. We're going to do something else. They just go through the motions of having the community meetings and things like that when they know that there's nothing that anybody can do. I grew up in Chinatown. My parents grew up in Chinatown. My grandparents grew up in Chinatown. It's sad. If you can hardly find anybody that's still from Chinatown living in Chinatown anymore. Everybody's moving out. A lot of people moved out. And I think a lot of people are going to move out, especially when that jail goes up and it moves out. I mean, I'm looking to leave Chinatown too. And I've been here my whole life. I'm 60 years old and I've been here my whole life.
This driving out of people is indicative of creating an artificial, unaffordable housing situation, a degradation of the quality of life by putting unwanted land use projects in Chinatown to this day. And I think that we have to shine a mirror back at our government and say, shame on you. You are responsible for this. Because Chinatown, from having dirt roads in the 19th century and having very low quality of life, was all built up by Chinese people. It was not at the help of the government that came in and handed us our stores, our businesses. That was all done by Chinese people themselves. So left to our own, we're very, very capable of taking what is dirt, I guess, and turning it into the community that people who are non-Asian find very desirable to live in today. So the failure has been to keep us from growing.
When I was interested in Neighbors United below Canal, because originally it was Jan Lee, Howard Huey, who are both Chinese Chinatown residents and landlords, and then Christopher Marte, who's the city council member for Lower East Side and Chinatown, and he's Afro-Dominican, but he speaks Chinese, and his brother actually had been incarcerated for a long time. I thought it was interesting that it was such a actively multiracial solidarity effort towards getting the jail.
This is just not one march of one type of people. We have people from all nationalities. We have people from all boroughs, from the South Bronx to Queens to Brooklyn, all here today in a unified voice. Yeah! We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. We don't need a new jail. We need investment in communities, especially communities of colors, especially in low-income communities.
They're working towards a solidarity between the people in Chinatown and people on the Lower East Side who are formerly incarcerated, who oppose the jail for various reasons. A lot of people in Chinatown learned about abolition in this moment because they were talking to Black abolitionists and Chinese abolitionists. That was a great moment for solidarity building.
High School 10年級嘅同學嚟嘅，我哋咧今日係為咗支持呢個反種族歧視嘅示威行動啊，一定要即係多啲人，先至可以即係俾人知道我哋中國人唔係少啊，而且我哋要爭取我哋嘅應得嘅平等。其他少數民族嘅話，一樣要團結，因為我哋喺美國嚟講，呢個係移民嘅國家。如果大家唔團結嘅話，呢個國家只有衰落去。
Since the COVID lockdown was lifted, over 24 new businesses have opened in Chinatown's core, and almost exclusively, those businesses are Chinese owned. which means that there's still a very high level of risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and optimism in Chinatown. Being a community organizer for 25 years, Chinatown's an extremely resilient place because the Chinese people are very resilient. It's not only a gateway city, but we are a gateway to America. What holds us back is our own government that continues to use Chinatown as a dumping ground for a larger carceral footprint of jails, an ever-increasing footprint of the NYPD that keeps taking over more and more land, closing streets and parking all over the place, expanding their presence into what should be a thriving economic community in Manhattan. But I think that the future has to be one where government stops using Chinatown as a dumping ground and stops being racist toward us by excluding us from these conversations about how our land is used. I think that the future has to be represented by more people who are in office. I think the future should be represented by young people who are in the nonprofit world who continue to uplift our community, whether it's storytelling or art or entrepreneurship or creating grants that will help people start their new businesses or keep old businesses in process.
And so we've been taking on all these little battles and never giving up and giving people an opportunity to say, we can actually change the neighborhood we live in. We can, have our voices at the table. If not, we're going to push back.
This isn't over. Don't believe anybody that says this is a done deal.
That's right. It's not done.
I'm the United States of America. For the people, by the people, of the people. Right? So what? We are human. They are human, we are human. We should equality among everybody.